You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary.
Well, Dr. Willson, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Forum Podcast. Kind of get us started, I would love for you to tell me a little about your faith journey, as well as kind of your path into academia and becoming a professor.
Yeah, so my faith journey, and first of all, it's wonderful to have this conversation with you, Leah. Thanks for the invitation. My faith journey, I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in California, in the Sierra Nevada, the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, and grew up in an evangelical church, non-denominational context. My parents were very involved in the church, teaching. My dad was an elder. Doing marriage counseling and all kinds of parenting classes. So I grew up in the faith, and then it was during my first year of college. Actually, I thought I was going to be playing soccer, and I got cut from the team. And here I was in a new city. I'd never been there. I grew up in a small town, and the one thing that I looked to for security was taken from me. And So yeah, it was my first year of university. Was a pretty dark time. I wouldn't have named it that back then, but I would say, looking back now, I would say I was depressed, and I wasn't living on campus. I was living off campus, so I didn't have dorm life.
Yep.
And let's see what else. So it was a public university. It wasn't a Christian context, but there were a lot of Christian clubs or groups, and then I was really involved in my church. And so it was that first year of college that I would say that my faith really took on a deeper level of ownership. So, and then I got real involved in ministry. I floundered a bit, actually quite a while in school, and was really involved with ministry, and then had to get my act together and learn how to be a student. So I was on academic probation my first 2 winters of university, and then had to learn how to be a student, and so that I could get my GPA up high enough so I could switch majors into business. So
Okay.
yeah. So, but during that time, that was university. I mentioned that because, so I got involved with church leadership. I was a pastor to young adults, college ministry for several years as a student. And then when I graduated, was hired as the director of college ministries. And then after that, during that time, I got my master's in business and ended up teaching.
Okay.
And stepped out of church ministry to teach at the university, and loved teaching. Found out that I, as much as I love the church, I really loved the classroom, and did that for 2 years. And then during that time, I felt God called me back in to serve the church in a more direct way. So then I went to seminary and picked up and moved further south to Long Beach, California. Started seminary, went to Fuller Seminary, and it was during that time that I met Richard Mouw. He's the former president of Fuller Seminary, and that's where I got into I had been introduced to the Reformed tradition through Tim Keller's ministry, his audio cassette tapes back in the 90s.
Oh, you gotta love the audio cassette tapes.
Yep. I still have some somewhere. And but then it was through Rich Mouw that I got into the Reformed tradition. So, and then halfway through my Master's of Divinity, I realized I really love the church. But I think I could best serve the church as a professor. So that's why I finished getting a PhD and then was hired here 10 years ago. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's a little bit. So I was not, it's a long way to answer your question. I had no ambition. I don't view myself as an intellectual or as an academic in that regard. It was something that grew on me, and I found myself in this. And it was more of a sense of this is where I feel I could best serve the church. So that's why I went on and got another degree. And so, yeah.
I love that. It's, sometimes that's not how God works. It's not necessarily that right away, you're going to do this and this is how it's going to work out. It's a very gradual thing, right? Yeah.
I had a friend who, growing up, ever since second grade, he knew he wanted to be an Air Force fighter pilot. And that's what he did. And he's already retired. He's been retired for 10 years. I'm like, you're retiring when I actually get after 20 years. And I'm like, I'm just getting my first, career job, if you will. And he's already retired. So
the Lord really does work in different ways.
Yes. That was not my story. Yeah.
Yeah. But you still do have an incredible story, though. And you brought Richard Mouw, and you did your PhD at Fuller as well. In addition to Richard Mouw, who were some of your mentors at Fuller, and then what kind of propelled you to the study of missiology?
So that's another, man, I'll try to be shorter on these responses. So other mentors, I mean, there's the direct mentor, like Life on Life. That would have been, all along, many people on the way in the church, pastors, and they continue to be that. So those life mentors. Chief among my early years would have been my dad and my brother, even though I still love them. There's been other mentors along the way. My first college pastor who pulled me into college ministry, who believed in me, and gave me a heart, cultivated the heart for the church. In my studies, Rich Mouw and Doug McConnell at Fuller, they were both there. Doug was a missionary and a missiologist, Rich Mouw being a philosopher, theologian. Also, Kees and Margriet van der Kooi, they are in the Netherlands. He was a former professor of systematic theology at the Free University of Amsterdam. So I did a joint program with Fuller and the Free. So both Kees and Margriet have been mentors in terms of, how do you do theology for the church? Doug McConnell and Rich Mouw had already set me on that trajectory, but Kees and Margriet would have been additional mentors. So those are a few. And then the study of missiology. So missiology, like I figured we should probably say what missiology is, because it's a big word.
Yeah.
Missiology is a look at the mission of the church from different, if you want to say, disciplines or perspectives. So it's about church history. It's also about theology and the Bible. There's a lot that's been done around anthropology. And during different eras, there's been different missiologists. There have been like the era of theology was really influential, and then it was the area of biblical studies. And so people would get their training in biblical studies or theology, and then look at the study of the church and its mission, right? And so what drew me to that? I really care about the church, and particularly as it intersects with its mission in the world. And so missiology, so I'm trained as a theologian, actually, not as a missiologist.
Yeah.
I was hired here as a missiologist. But what attracts me and keeps me interested is that I feel like it's the questions of the church as it's on mission, all the way back through the writing of Paul's letters in the New Testament, throughout church history following that. I think that some of the sharpest and most acute questions arise from the church as it carries out its mission. Yeah. So, for Paul, can Christians eat meat sacrificed to idols? That's not a intellectual question. That's first and foremost a life question. And it's a question that wouldn't have occurred to a Jewish follower of Jesus. It is a peculiarly Gentile question, because you have Gentiles joining the church. Yep. And now all of a sudden, because for Jews, they would have nothing to do with that meat. So now it's a real life question. So all that to say, Paul's theological writings come off of issues in the church as it lives out its mission. What does it look like to cultivate followers of Jesus when they're asking a whole set of new questions that our community hasn't asked before? So that's what drew me to the study of missiology, is that it really sharpens the questions about how does the church interface with its mission in the world. And there's more in that in terms of where do we get our understanding of mission? Is it simply evangelism or proclamation, or does it also involve how we live out our faith and our actions and our deeds in terms of justice and lifestyle? And then also, is mission something that we do? Does it originate with the church? Or is it something that more of God has a mission that he has called us to be a part of in the world? And how you answer that question really shapes a lot in terms of discipleship and in the Christian life. So
you mentioned, addressing some of the life questions of the church and addressing those kind of throughout time. You've written a book called Work and Worship. And it seems to me like in that book, you're seeking to address some of those life questions, right? But can you tell me a little bit, like, how did that book kind of come to be? What what inspired it for you, and what is maybe the main heart behind that book for those who haven't read it?
Yeah, so I wrote that book. I co-authored that with a friend of mine, Matt Kamink. And so this has been a long time conversation between he and I. He had his own pastoral experience of being an intern at Redeemer Church in New York City. I had my experience of college ministry working with young adults, and they're asking these questions around work, vocation, sense of calling. And we both had so we had experience with that. And I think one of the things is that where did that book come from? It came from our talking with Christians in the marketplace and the questions that they had, and seeing the disconnect between the questions that they had and then the materials or the discipleship processes of the church. And not that it was wrong, but it was like, I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine, he's a nurse, and he read a book. I won't mention the author's name, but it's a great book. It's one I highly recommend about work and the Christian life. And he was reading that, and he said, this book is really great, but the author assumes that we all like our work, and we're just looking for meaning in our work. And he said, I know my work matters to God, but I don't care. Like that's not my question. I only do it because it helps offset the salary. My wife is a worship pastor, and they don't pay her enough. So I know my work matters to God, but that's not my question. And so that cued me up to really focus on what are the questions that workers are asking. Not that our study and our tradition, we should throw it out the window. But I also don't think it's effective or helpful to say, well, here's the questions, Leah, you should be asking, but you aren't, without ever starting with, like, what are the questions you have? Maybe I can help you see that these questions you should be asking. But also, I mean, there's often been times where it's like, no, I don't think that's an important question for you. So that's really where the book came out of. And so the disconnect there, and particularly the big project there the big hope was that so much has been written about theology of work, the faith and work movement, and none of it really addresses Sunday morning. And so when church leaders get excited about a book on faith and work or theology of work, they tend to either do a sermon series or a book study on it, maybe small groups. None of that's wrong, but they actually don't address what happens on Sunday morning. And it moves it more into, if I just give you this theology that your work matters to God, that's what you really need. Then you can go and live it out. And what I found in my dissertation work, which is not this book, but it was on the same topic, was that some of the most powerful and formative experiences that workers had arose from their work week and when they brought that into church on Sunday. And then they heard the sermon, or when they prayed the prayers, or when they sang the songs. There was a connection between what took place in their life throughout the week and their work, and with what was happening during the worship service, if you want to call it the liturgy. And so for me, it's that dialogue between how does Sunday morning, how is it in dialogue with what happens throughout the week, and how do we facilitate more of a worship as dialogue, not as monologue, not just conveying theology, but actually giving space for workers to come into the worship and voice their praises, their laments, their confessions, their petitions. And that is a welcome and integral part of worship. So that's really, I guess, maybe one way into talking about the book.
I love that so much. As you were writing this book, was there a particular topic or even chapter that you were writing that was impactful for your own walk with Christ?
Yeah. So there are a couple. I mean, there's a topic, but then there's two layers to that, and I'll try to be brief about this. But one layer would be I had a conversation with a woman who was a speech therapist working with stroke patients in hospitals. And and I was just asking about her work and what is it like, and she was talking a lot about the demands, the stresses, the just working with that population of clients, and I just asked her, like, man, your work sounds very stressful. What gives you strength or energy to do your work? And without missing a beat, she said, the benediction. And I was like, what? I mean, so this was at a church. It's a non-denominational church. They don't even use the word liturgy. They do have a benediction every week. And this is not a person that would be able to give you like a worldview answer of why her work matters to God. But she said, I said, unpack that for me. What was it about the benediction that is so powerful for you? And she said, well, I always have my clients come to mind throughout the week all the time. And whenever their face comes to mind, I just say a prayer, God, would you please grant them healing, and also give me wisdom on what treatment plan to pursue with them. And then I go on about my day. She said, so on Sunday morning, when we say the benediction, when the benediction is said, I picture my clients in front of me, and I hear God say to me, go out and serve them on my behalf. So what was impactful for me is I know way more about the theology, the history, and the philosophy behind the theology of work and liturgy. But my own experience of Sunday morning worship in light of what was going on. So at the time, I had like a couple essays out. I was waiting to hear back if they would get published. I didn't know if I was going to have a job. So I had all this anxiety and worry, and I wasn't praying about it at all, particularly on Sunday morning. That was not entering into my petitions, my confessions, whatever. And so watching and listening to people who have spiritual practices that far outpace even my best theology. And so that kind of set me thinking, like, wow, how can I encourage, nurture, share her story with others, but also do what I can to help pastors, worship leaders, those who design or craft Sunday morning worship, that this is the kind of formation we should be aimed at. So that would be like one of the, just even how we simply, like how I engage in worship on Sunday. And then most recently at our church, I preached one week and talked a little bit about the offering of first fruits in the Old Testament and how the New Testament and the early church took that over as a paradigm of worship. And so the service would begin with parishioners bringing forward work of their hands and laying it on the altar. And then a pastor or an elder during the service would take that loaf you just brought or that wine you just aged in your cellar and would pray over it, bless it, and it would become the body and blood in the Eucharist for God's people. So I was talking about that as a paradigm, and I said, so next week is Pentecost, and I encourage you to bring something material that either is something you made or is symbolic of the work of your hands, whether it's for pay or not for pay. If you're working with kids and you're at home as a parent, that's your work throughout the week, that's fine. Something symbolic, and bring it forward, and we'll start the service that week. And as I was thinking through, I brought two things. One was a schedule of an event I was hosting that week with pastors here, and the other was the frying pan. And there was that frying pan, thinking through, what am I going to bring about fatherhood and that part of my work, my vocation? And I had just taken my oldest son, camping for the first time. And we were earlier that week. And it was going to rain. It was early in May. It was going to rain, and he had never been camping before. And so I was stressed, or just more focused on getting the tent set up, and he just wanted to play and mess around, and I just was not as playful. I mean, I wasn't mean or harsh, but I just wasn't present in the way that I wanted to be. And so as I was preparing, like, what am I going to bring up? That frying pan, for me, it's God, this was the work of my hands this week, and there's confession in it. Like, it's not like, I hope I am more present and less stressed and task-oriented next time. So there's confession in it, but also it's a gratitude. I'm so grateful for the moments that I was able to have with my son, and I bring that forward, and it's pleasing and acceptable to God because of Jesus, my high priest, not because it's a perfect offering. And so for me, like that was one of those things, like just actually finding something material that is I made or symbolizing what I made is so important to the kind of formation that we're after. So I had written this book and I'd done it in different ways, but never done anything that specific.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, here I am, 4 years after writing a book on this, and I'm still learning, like, how do I re-engage what happens in the week, the work of my hands, the joys, sorrows, confessions, with what happens on Sunday. And so those are two themes around, I would say, offering and then learning from workers who and their spiritual practices. Those are two themes that I continue to be impacted from the writing and the process of writing.
I love that story. And as I'm hearing you talk about it, it sounds like there's a good division in your research almost of like you're talking to people, and then you're also maybe doing a little bit more of the like theological and like liturgical church side of things. I guess maybe unpack that for me. Like how much I love hearing people's stories, even the stories you're sharing right now. So how much of writing this book was just sitting and listening and then kind of putting that into words? And then how much of it was kind of drawing upon what you and your co-author kind of already had intellectually?
Yeah, so that was a joy of and also the challenge, right? So this is almost like a marriage, if you think about it that way. Like there was a lot of wrestling that took place between my co-author Matt, who's a good friend, and I. And part of it is that tension, it's that struggle, right? And so I mean, I'll just say on this book, Matt did like truckloads of background biblical historical research. I had done some of it, but Matt did so much. I had done all the like ethnographic sociological research before in my dissertation. And then we had both continued to work out and work with workers in different discipling ways. And so then it became like, just a brotherly kind of wrestling match. Like, how do we actually get this thing produced? But the book itself, I think, doesn't fit into a neat category. It does biblical, historical, theological, liturgical, and sociological. And it was a work of a labor of love, but it was how do you get that balance right? And so one thing I would say, like, so I'll give a concrete example. Matt had done something awesome on the faith, or on work and offering and the prophets, the chapter, and he hit pretty hard on it on the first draft about idolatry, and I pushed back on it. I said, Matt, like, the Israelites weren't idiots. There has to be something that drew them to this idolatry. So I'm not saying we condone the idolatry, but can we empathize? Like, what is the human element that I could see why someone would be drawn to it? So this grew out of it. I told him, like, our experience, my wife and my experience with infertility. Medical science not giving us a lot of questions, and it is over and over and over again. And I say it tongue in cheek, but there was moments where I'm like, man, you know what? If I thought sacrificing a chicken would like work, I can understand why somebody would do that. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a belittling way. I'm just saying as just an example of stepping out of like the Western science mode. But can we empathize? And so that was one of those times where, and I feel like where we ended up in that chapter, because we were able to hear each other. It's like, I'm not saying get rid of the theology or the biblical exegesis. I'm just saying the inroad. It's not going to, it's just going to not land with workers well. Like look at those idiots who are offering, those dumb Israelites. It's like, no, I mean, we continue to do this. And if you don't somehow empathize, then you actually aren't going to identify the ways idolatry pulls at our own hearts. Because idolatries aren't rational. They're not like, an idol doesn't go at your mind. It goes at your affect. It goes at your gut. It goes like about your worry about your loved ones or your future. It's like that's where, where idols work, not necessarily at the intellectual, cerebral level. So anyway, that.
No, I love that. I love it. You're talking a lot about kind of bringing these things into daily life, bringing things into daily practice. I think there's often a temptation in the church these days to maybe make like something like prayer or lament or kind of spiritual disciplines as a really broad category as something that, well, you should do them, but then there's not a lot of maybe talk on why they're important. And especially in the context of people's vocations. Like you said, they have a whole work week and they're not really able to bring that into Sundays. And then Sundays may often not prepare them to kind of go into that fresh work week, kind of thinking about how does my faith actually overlap?
Right.
You have that disconnect. For you, how could prayer or lament or those other spiritual disciplines actually connect to the lives of workers in their daily lives, not just on Sundays? And I guess, how could the church do better at kind of facilitating that connection or encouraging that?
Yeah. So our, Jamie Smith, a philosopher, has written a lot about like ritual and liturgy. And he has a phrase, he has a line that he says, if all of life is to be worship, the sanctuary is where we learn how. And what he means by that is like the bodily movements and the affective elements of corporate worship shape our imagination, shapes our loves, and that then should carry over. It's an overflow into how we live out our life in the world. So one of the ways, like I've heard worship leaders talk about this, is like, what words can I put on people's lips on Sunday that will meet them in the grind on Wednesday, right? So there's that aspect of it, right? So that's the kind of the direction the arrow is pointing from Sunday morning out into the week.
Yeah.
And I'll get to I promise to get to like what we found, or what I found in my dissertation research of interviewing all these workers in different cities and vocations, was that that's what Jamie says is true. But so if all of life is to be worship, Sunday is where we learn how, or the sanctuary is where we learn how. What I found from my interview with workers is that, okay, that's true, but if the sanctuary is going to be formative, you must bring your work week in. So if I really wanted to get at your question, if I want to cultivate spiritual practices throughout the week that are connected to Sunday, the first thing I would do would actually be start with helping workers bring their experiences into the sanctuary. So what that means is, so the paradigm we use is priest and parish. So every Christian is a priest, and they are frontline workers in God's mission in their daily life and work, whether that's in a paid work at a workplace, home with children or aging parents, or where you volunteer and where you spend your time in your retirement. Those are your parishes, and you are called to be a priest. In that, you have a parish as a space or a community in which you have particular responsibility. Yeah. And that's the primary way that you actually participate in God's mission. It's not like over and above. You need to also do evangelism or oversee whatever. I mean, like, no, that is actually the primary place of discipleship and mission. So then the question is not so much how do I in the priestly metaphor, it's a priest always stands in relationship between two or more parties. Yeah. And so we tend to emphasize, like we meaning Protestant Reformed folks, that we are a priests who represent God to humanity. We put a lot of emphasis. It's true. But I actually would say the starting point pedagogically would be actually you're a priest also that should represent your humanity, or you say your work colleagues, their joys, sorrows, petition, confessions, sins, bringing those before God. And if you learn about the history, the heart, the hurt, the hope of your parish, of the people, the colleagues around you, and you're coming into worship, I'm not just voicing my own lament, but also for my coworker who's on the brink of divorce, or for this, conflict-ridden, situation at work. And I'm coming into Sunday morning and lifting up the praises, the laments, the petitions from my workplace. That's going to form me in a unique way. And then also, when you are throughout the week, then those lines. So we just had one of these night of worship at the we host work and worship seminars for 3 or 4 days, twice a year through the Institute for Mission, Church, and Culture. And part of it is it's experiential.
Yeah.
And we had a night of worship, and it was amazing to hear people the next day reflect on a line from a song or a phrase from a prayer or a psalm, or the physical act of coming forward and putting on the altar, on the Lord's table, a praise or a lament. That there was something there that hooked, that it like stood out to people.
Yeah.
And so that means, though, when they are commuting to work, when they are have those lunchtime breaks or whatever, those lines or phrases, the question would be, what are spiritual practices? Whether it's wearing a bracelet that's like, this is a reminder of that either the benediction that was spoken over me or that word from the Lord, your labor is not in vain. I am with you. And so thinking about ways in which you can take those moments where you heard from God, the Spirit prompted you in some way on Sunday, and bringing those into your day, your work day or your work week. So that would be like a starting point. There are more practical things too, but that would be, I'm like, instead of adding something else on, let's just start with what is already happening.
Yeah.
And then we'll build on there. But there are other things. I mean, workers, having a commuter liturgy. So thinking through the topography. What are the landmarks between my doorstep and the workplace? And how might those serve as prompts for me to reflect on God's character, God's promises, my calling or God's calling upon me in the community I'm serving. So there's commuting to and from practices that people engage in. There are, even praying the hours, adapting some of the monastic model of just setting up times throughout the day where you are moving your body and, kind of reconnecting your awareness of God, of your body, and of the work of your hands. So there are a lot of different practices I've seen workers, being creative with, and we try to help coach some of that as well in our workshops. But there's a few ideas.
I love that. I love the idea you've brought it up a few times of physically laying something down, like at the altar, if you will. And my mind immediately went to how would a Protestant church kind of react to that, right? Of like, typically it's very, very formal, very much like welcome in. So even just putting myself like, how would I react if that was in my church? And that would be really, really helpful, right? So I'm sure you've had some of those conversations of people like, would my church respond well to this? And I love that idea. It's just me reflecting. One of the aspects of worship that I think we're missing a lot in the church right now is lament. In your research and your experience, how have you seen maybe people incorporate that well? And then what recommendations would you have for churches that are seeking to do that better?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this gets at, right, the different tradition, the different denominational and even cultural context. So I think one of the things is to make sure that people understand that there is a deep biblical grounding for lament. Another initiative, this is not a marketing ploy, but another offering that the Institute for Mission, Church, and Culture offers is experiential Psalms retreats, where we learn how to pray the Psalms. And this is different than studying the Psalms, is actually praying them. And so I think, but having that biblical understanding that it's not just, so when particularly on the topic of lament, I think one of the big hurdles that a church has to, at least the churches I work with, that I have to help them get over is, if God is sovereign, why should I lament? Isn't there meaning in this? Doesn't he have a purpose? Didn't he plan or cause this? So therefore, how does lament fit square with that? It's basically, God is sovereign, so buck up and shut up. And if that's not explicitly said, that is definitely more of the what's implied.
Definitely.
And so I think one of the things is actually helping them understand that God's sovereignty actually it doesn't mitigate, but actually it's the foundation of lament. So, one of the ways of looking at that is that, God's Scripture tells us about God's character, his purposes, his promises, his power. And the unique part of this, the unique role that the book of Psalms plays is it's our prayer book, and it gives us language acquisition. It's the prayer and worship book for Jews and Christians for millennia. And what the Psalms teach us is like the rest of Scripture speaks to us, but the Psalms speak for us. And what that means for the psalmist is that these affirmations and declarations of God's goodness, his power, his sovereignty need to be taken seriously. And when our lived experience in the world, it doesn't reflect God's character, his purposes and promises, the psalmists tell us that biblical faith, it requires lament. Not being quiet about it. And so helping people understand that actually when you lament, it's not just for Leah, who tends to be more emotive, or for Cory, who's more whatever, dramatic. It's actually, no, that is worship. Mm-hmm. That is a pleasing aroma in God's eyes. Yeah. Because you're actually taking God's character and his purposes and promises seriously. Mm-hmm. So if you want to look at a biblical text, you can look at the story of Jacob wrestling, which I think is really interesting text, but also before that of Abraham, where God in Genesis 18, God calls Abraham and he says, I'm choosing you to teach your children the way of righteousness and justice, right? Mishpat and tzedakah. And then in that same passage, God says, should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And he talks about, I'm going to destroy Sodom. And what Abraham does is he actually takes God's character and his purpose. You called us to pursue righteousness and justice, me and my family. Mm-hmm. But how does destroying the good with the evil, or the just with the unjust, how does that line up with your character? And so he's like, if there's 50, would you do it 45? The odd text. Basically, what you're learning there is what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says is that actually Abraham, that's a schooling for Abraham to be a real covenant partner. And I actually think that you can tie, that's what the Psalms of Lament are doing. Yeah. That this is an act of faith, taking God's character, his promise, and his purposes, and his mission for his people seriously. When there's a disconnect between God's character, his purposes, and his promises, biblical faith calls us to lament and to cry out, not to shut up. Yeah. And so an example would be, I taught a little bit at a church in Albuquerque, and the college pastor took the four movements of praise, confession, lament, and petition, and built a kind of weekly or monthly worship service around that. And he emailed me a couple of years later. I had no idea he'd done that. And he said, we actually had someone come to faith during our lament service night. And I'm like, and so he went on to tell the story of a woman came to the night of lament, and she's actually an atheist. And her friend had invited her, and she's like, okay, I'll go because of my friend. And she said that her own testimony was that as she was in there in the worship service around all these people crying out to this God that she didn't believe in, crying out in lament, she's like, what kind of people do this? And somehow the Spirit of God worked in her heart, and she started crying out in lament because earlier that week, her aunt, who she loved dearly, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so here she is lamenting to a God she doesn't even believe exists. And the Spirit of God opens her eyes, and she comes to faith. Wow. Gives her life to Jesus. Now, I'm not saying we use lament as an evangelistic ploy. What I am saying is that when we as a church, the Psalms show us humanity at full stretch. There's every human emotion needs to be brought before our sovereign God, and it gives us language for doing that, from rage and anger to joy to pain to praise, everything in between. Yep. And when we do that, we are voicing creation's praise. We shouldn't be surprised when we do that in front of the watching world, that people go, there's something in that awakens in me a deep longing for God, and also a longing for, I was created to be one of those, priests who voice creation's praise. So anyway, those are a couple ways. There are practical ways. You can do it in small groups. At the church that I was at in Long Beach, Sunday morning was a sacred cow, and so but we didn't have Sunday night service. So I actually didn't go through the normal structures. I went to people that were open, and we created a night of worship once a quarter, and we'd have lament. And the numbers of people that turned out, and then over time, those who ran the services on Sunday began to take it and said, okay, like our night of New Year's Eve service, after like 3 or 4 years of us having the evening service, Sunday morning crew just said, no, we're going to take it for Sunday morning. And so it's one of those things where like, I just was talking to somebody yesterday, lamenting how hard it is to change the core programs. Yeah. And I understand that, but also like, don't burn too much energy on that. Yeah. Do something on the side with people that want in. Yep. And see how God works. And
absolutely.
Yeah. So instead of like bemoaning and just try to find some creative space with people who would join in with you. So, and that, so I could give more examples, but there's a few.
Those are fantastic. So switching gears a little bit, you've mentioned the Institute for Mission, Church, and Culture a couple times. Could you just tell me a little bit, like, how did that institute kind of come to be? Was it pre-work and worship book, or kind of a result, or a little bit of both?
So actually, I didn't start the Institute. It used to be called the Institute for Global Church Planting and Renewal. It was started by Professor Karl Bosma before me, and he retired, I think, the year that I came on. And so that was part of my my job from the beginning. Okay. And I ran that for several years. I directed that. And basically, post-COVID, there's a lot of changes that happened in the denomination and also in a space in which the seminary and the Christian Reformed Church exists. And so a lot of the original needs that institute was designed to meet, there are other actually agencies or organizations meeting those needs. Yep. So I kept the heart of it the same, but renamed it and focused it that actually gives us a not so grand a vision, a little bit more narrow. And it really looks at that intersection between God's mission, the local church, and culture. So the ways we think about that is, the first question is, what is God's mission in the world? How do we understand it? The second question is, what does a church need to be doing to participate in God's mission? And then the third question, and this is the one that's a little subversive, is what does a seminary need to do to serve the church as it equips God's people to participate in the mission of God? And so the seminary isn't at the top coming up with all these new ideas, and then we'll just let it trickle down to the churches. No, the seminary should serve the church, resource the church the church is really the front line. Yeah. Absolutely. Where, for better or for worse, I know it's not perfect. I know it's broken. I know many things, but the church is actually where disciples are made. Seminary plays a role, but even pastors, the seminary does not make a pastor. The local church makes the pastor. The seminary should play a role in helping equip. So that was really the focus of kind of focusing in on that. And then just to make sure that we're focused, for me, there are many offerings out there, many approaches to how do you help churches that are facing, that need renewal. There are many approaches to church planting. For me, historically and theologically, I see that the Spirit is always, you can't guarantee the Spirit will work, but where the Spirit likes to work is around the empowering, equipping of the priesthood of all believers. So we don't do anything that doesn't somehow frontline a focus on equipping, empowering churches to cultivate the priesthood of all believers. Yeah. And so that's a little bit about the Institute and how it came about. Yeah.
I love that. You've kind of highlighted already how, corporate worship has that role in cultivating that priesthood of all believers. But on the flip side of that, what challenges have you noticed, either locally or globally, is the church kind of facing as they're seeking to understand that priestly call in their daily life?
Yeah, there are many challenges. One, I would say, so I think that one way to look at this is that the pandemic that we are still particularly the local churches, are still feeling the aftermath of that, where the normal rhythms of gathering and scattering were upended. And there's a lot of people going like, I can do church, quote unquote, with, my neighbors and my best friends. Why would I go back? So I think that one of the big challenges is raising the question. And also I can listen to whoever your favorite preacher is, on YouTube.
I'll just watch online.
Yeah, I'll just watch online, or I'll listen to so and so's podcast because they're actually, a great orator. And so I think there's a lot that I think churches are facing, trying to return back to the old, like how do we get everybody back and really make it an attractive kind of draw? And I understand that, but I think that I believe there's an invitation from God in this, for us to think through, okay, now that all these rhythms are upended, how might we rethink and how do we center everything we're doing should be around equipping and empowering the priesthood of all believers. So, you need to have excellence. You don't need to, if it's just sloppy, someone just off the cuff is just, I don't know, I just picked this song. Because you don't want that. I'm not saying that. But I think that a lot of the challenges that churches are facing are that pressure, to make everything attractive again, at least in the context here. I think that if you look more, globally, there's just a lot in terms of a lot of places where the church is a minority in the culture, and Christians are a minority in the culture. And so how does the church what is its role in fostering disciples who resist the inward spiritual, but give over the public and the political? I think there's a lot of pain around that. And so because if we think through, what I mean by that is, is Jesus Lord of my prayer life, my spiritual life, my inner life, my thought life? Absolutely. But are we cultivating Christians to think through is Jesus Lord over how I manage the employees who are under my care, how I participate or don't participate, or I'm creative in how I participate in this particular economy, or how so those kinds of questions. I think there in those places the stakes are higher. In those places where Christians are a minority, the stakes are higher, and there is that pressure to move into let's just focus on right doctrine and inner spirituality. And I'm not throwing stones, but I think that's where there's a place of pain. So here in North America, it's going to be more, you can use the word consumeristic, or just appealing to the attractive, the draw, and then more globally, it would be, how do we do discipleship? How do we approach discipleship that does justice to the gospel when it is, if you start thinking through the gospel and its dimensions for public life, it could get you imprisoned or, even something more drastic. So,
You've mentioned as well in our conversation, you do the Psalms retreat, and then you have your work and worship seminars with IMCC. How are these? Tell me a little bit about these retreats, and how are these? Who are you working with? And then how are they kind of able to take what they're learning and bring it into their own context?
Yeah, so the Institute for Mission, Church, and Culture, there are two. We were the recipient of a 5-year Lilly grant for thriving congregations. So really, this is really trying to aim at how do we help congregations find strength, wholeness, and resources that, for us, empower, equip the priesthood of all believers. So the approach is for both. There are two different. Psalms Retreat is different than the Work and Worship seminar or workshop. What's similar is that in both, we really encourage participants, congregations, to send 2 to 3 people. That could be at least one staff member, but the others could be lay people, counselors, small group, whatever. Each church can decide. And the core of these are to be experiential. So it's not just content delivery. If there is content delivery, it happens before or after the gatherings. And so we really try to create experiences, but also like I said, workshop practices, so that you catch it, the vision that we're after.
Yep.
Because it's a lot easier. I could communicate through a video or writing very clearly and quickly and more simply the theology and the biblical exegesis.
Yep.
The big blocks are at the affective, the relational, and the systemic.
Absolutely.
And so bringing 2 to 3 different people from a congregation together to experience it together, for them to have space to dream, to think about how might we incarnate this differently in our contexts. And so with the Psalms retreat, that's really focusing on spiritual practices that affect either how you disciple throughout the week, how you design worship on Sunday morning. And it really is reinstalling the Psalms as the prayer and worship book of God's people. So just the full breadth of that. And so if you're there and you're a participant as a worship leader, then there's space for you to not only experience it, but then reflect on, okay, let's look at my songs that we've picked or we've played over the last, on Planning Center over the last 6 months.
Yeah.
If we have buckets of, praise, lament, confession, adoration, where would I put the songs in which buckets, or the prayers?
Yep.
And what is overloaded and what isn't? And how might you grow in that? What questions do you have? Who else here might, we have resources, but we don't want to just say church in a box kind of thing. Like, oh, we have, here's what you should do.
Yep.
But really want to empower this team to do their own self-reflection. If you are on the Psalms retreat and you are more of like a men's Bible study or men's ministry, women's ministry, then you think we have a space like, okay, where in our discipling work are we giving language for rage and anger, or when you're betrayed? How are we discipling people to pray and to find connection practices that deal with these, different human experiences? And so you'll have an opportunity to think through, okay, where is this happening? Is it happening? And then what might we do? And so we would journey with people. So we have a Zoom call every 2 or 3 months where those who participated can join in. We have coaches that can be there if people want assistance or, guide into different resources. Similar with the work and worship, it's around, but it depends on, if you are coming as a small business owner, you're going to experience this more in terms of an activation of imagination of oh, I never thought about spiritual practices for my work, or here's what I'm trying. I'm trying to think through what's a management process from the employees in my small business that allows that is concerned about profit, but also about them developing as persons, and so not just having a single bottom line. And so your imagination may be pricked or peaked there. And if you're, a lead pastor or a preaching pastor, then there'll be opportunities for you to think through when I give an invitation, the invocation, a call to worship, when I say you've all had a hard week and stressful week, and we encourage you just to set all that aside as you come into worship and just, let's just hear from the Lord. You'll learn on that workshop, that seminar, you should never say that. And you'll have space to think through okay, what are 3 or 4 different ways of framing the invitation that encourages people, right? Or how do, different ways of framing the offering, or where are those spaces in which, where are those practices for us as a staff where we have a regular feedback, a regular input of what's really going on in the life of congregants, and how do we create a steady stream of it's not just, you can go do a workplace visit, that's great, but where are the spaces where we're actually learning? Where is the rub, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the questions?
Yeah.
What are the challenges? And not just, I'm really excited about this next sermon series, this next book study. How do I get everyone to get excited about what I think is best? As good as that may be and understandable as that may be, can we also cultivate church leaders who think through, like, where are people? What is really going on, and how might we, bring those worlds together?
Yep.
So I'm not saying sacrifice your vision or leadership. I'm just saying to have ways in which that's a bit more informed about the real realities. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I love that. Just to kind of wrap things up, I have loved hearing about the book and the work you're doing with IMCC. What are you excited for that's kind of on the horizon for you, either in your teaching or in research or writing or with IMCC? What's something exciting that you're looking forward to?
So I'd say a couple things. Can I say three things real quick?
Oh, you absolutely can.
Okay. So one would be to finish off with the Psalms retreat and work and worship seminars. These are really focused on congregations, and that's really what the grant is focused on. However, we do have current students and former students who are participating in these. So I'm excited because students are learning through this grant, and they're able to experience what we're talking about alongside of church leaders, other church leaders. So the grant is already not only helping us connect with new churches, new church leaders, but it also simultaneously is able to serve students, current students. And then also it helps for lifelong learning of those who were former students who are graduate, but I still want to learn and be connected to the seminary. So that's really exciting. Another area is that the other part of that this grant has allowed is that it gives us money. So every course that I teach in mission now has 4 professors. So it's me alongside of 3 others, Ann Kaptein, Albert Streithorst, and our missionary in residence, Melissa Boss. So between them, there's over 60 years of missions experience.
Yeah.
And so every core class on missions, students have 4 professors that they get to draw from, and also just throughout the halls. So I'm really excited about the relationships, the conversations that are taking place, even when I'm not there, around the global church, global mission, world Christianity. Yeah. And then finally, I'm really excited. I am making really good progress on the next book, which is a follow-up to Work and Worship.
All right.
And this one is, instead of the first book was was written to pastors and worship leaders. This book is actually going to be written to workers and really exploring some of the questions you were asking around in light of this holistic vision between work and worship Sunday and weekdays. What does discipleship look like, Monday through Saturday? Yeah. And so really have some ideas, some concepts that have, again, grown from workers themselves, but also combined with history, theology, and the Bible. So I'm excited to get that out. I'm ready for that. I'm hoping by the end of this academic year, I don't know if it won't be released, but that the book will be written by June is what I'm hoping. But
That's fantastic. Well, we'll be looking forward to that. Yeah. But in the meantime, thanks so much for joining us on the Forum Podcast today. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.